This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. This is Sunday, July the 29th, 2018. It's a nice drizzly day out there. I bicycled here, and in 15 minutes, I managed to not get completely drenched. My jeans are on the dampish side, so if you're thinking of going out and doing things, don't let the weather keep you in. The views and opinions expressed.
So, a lot of physical work this week. On Monday, Ron Sleater came from Decatur, and we harvested teasel with Don Mills too. So there's three of us, and Ron has spotted herbicided most of the teasel, but it doesn't exactly get everything. So the seed pods are somewhat viable. So we remove the teasel fruiting bodies and take the whole plant out. It's about 6 to 8 feet tall, curled over some with herbicide. But it's a pretty mean weed. It has a huge rosette on the bottom, and when you get 25 or 30 plants together, it can take out a lot of prairie. It tends to want to have soft soil, so when the prairie builds up organic matter and it's moist, then the teasel will come in. Where the prairie is on borrow pit soil, which is more or less gravel from a borrow pit is a gravel pit, and it's taken off about 8 feet of gravel. That is hard soil. It's not easy for teasel to get into it. But the teasel comes from the cemetery, and it is everywhere. It's from Ohio through the country. Teasel has taken over, and it is a very interesting dried arrangement, and it was early used to tease wool, but it is very invasive, and we need to get it off so that there's nothing seeds. So that having been done, we spent all day at that. It's pretty vigorous work. Use weed whackers. We're finding out that weed whackers actually break down, so I just bought a couple more. We need to keep that. Then the next invasive weed that's a problem is Canada thistle, and there's a big slug of it on the Lake Park Prairie. So we've been down there with Liz Kirby and Dan and his friend Vicky and myself, and it's amazing that you can get to succeed in getting rid of the fluffy seed that will blow all over, not only to your particular prairie, but everywhere else. We do need an incinerator or a burn pile to remove that seed so it's not viable anymore. At the moment, we have not any alternative other than to send it to the landfill, where we hope it will be composted and destroyed that way. And it would be very handy to have a burn pile. And so I've been talking to the master naturalists and see if we couldn't get something somewhere in the Twin Cities. Mowing continues. I'm so disappointed with mowing. The state has managed to put no mow signs on a lot of the corridors to Rantoul and north, and that's been very helpful, and that has not been mown. But but the county road north of our Pope Prairie, I was so pleased because there was a whole bunch of prairie on the roadside in a place where it didn't have, it didn't violate visual corridor. And bless me, yesterday I rounded the corner and it's all been mown. The silphiums with deep roots will survive and the grasses will survive. But it seems so unnecessary and so costly and so damning of the gene pool that we need to preserve. Some people help in a way by making hay. So the corridor north of Rantoul is mown for hay. We could use some help in some of this when we go to suggest people go to certain locations on our prairie or roadsides. It's very handy to have a grid, and so in the long run we need to have a grid there. Yesterday I had a visitor from the East Coast who we met with at Paxton, went to the Prospect Cemetery. Russell Taylor is an electrical engineer, but he's also a birder, and he was picking up birds that really, I've been here for a long while and I haven't developed the expertise, but he's very interested in that and very good at it. So we looked at the old Route 45 corridor and the Bloomington Moraine, and then we went to the Pope Prairie. And for those of you who are interested, the Pope Prairie is in good shape at the present time. The liatris is blooming, the compass plants are blooming, the purple clover is almost gone, the purple coneflower is in seed, the yellow coneflower is there, and it's a place that you can visit and enjoy at this time when there's kind of a peak in prairie. The dock has not come to flower yet, but it will come soon. The grasses are tall, big blue stem Indian grass, little blue stem. The baptisia is well potted, and we don't have much lead plant there, but the little remnant on the interurban to the west side of the prairie is doing very well. It has button liatris, which is not out yet, but you can see the buttons. It has bush clover. It has just a lot of range, and verbenias, and very shortly the golden Alexander will be seeding, and we can collect the seed. It's just a good time for looking around. It might help if you have Wellington boots to take, just in case you get ticks. We haven't had a problem with ticks, but partially it's because we're using preventative measures, and one of them is to have boots that have a high rise, like a Wellington boot. You have some wheelie patches that been active. One's 2-year-old old, and one is probably 8 years old. They really, for me, is where a two-wheeler or a four-wheeler goes round and round in circles, just having a riotous time, that they can do 70 years worth of damage in 5 minutes. And that leaves it very raw. The prairie plants have deep roots. Sometimes probably 2/3 of their plant is underground. So it comes back, and it's coming back on those wheelies, but they're dramatic. You can see where the damage was, even probably 20 and 30 years later. It has been a gravel pit, so it has truck marks there. But getting people together to work on that place is very helpful. Ron Sleater, in his earlier days, was thinking of being an entomologist, so he knows the insects, and some of them are quite dramatic. He has a butterfly that has purple and blue, and when it spreads its wings, it's wonderful to see. We do have prairie insects that work on the prairie. There's if you see a silphium with a bent over head that's dead, you'll have to know that there's a weevil there. A weevil has a long proboscis, and it gets into the compass plant and dock, and sometimes rosinweed, and it uglifies it a little, but it's part of the prairie ecosystem. And the wonder of the Pope Prairie is that it's connected to 10 miles of wider road, because there was going to be a dual highway that was replaced by 57, so it was never built. And it's wider because there was an interurban that went to Paxton too. So all that adds together. The Prospect Cemetery you can visit, but please be very careful and stay on the trail. The New Jersey tea is there. There's a lot of lead plant. There's just liatris is out there too, and the grasses are growing, but there's not an awful lot of grasses. It's mainly broadleaves. And the little road where the new 45 goes back onto the old 45 to go through Paxton, at that junction there's a nice drop seed, and you can get a general idea of what a prairie was like. And so that was interesting to do that. Yesterday I stayed behind and got a few of the teasels that we have missed. It's easy to miss a teasel. The roadside prairie is doing quite well, and it has not been mowed, and there are signs. Some of the signs are worn out, and they need to be more permanent. Probably a little more expensive to make, but the state puts them in, and Stephanie Dobbs, who works with the Department of Transportation doing roadside things, has a lot to do with those signs and establishing no-mow policies. This week I got a letter from the Prairie State Conservation Coalition. David knows that. We go to annual meetings that they hold in Starved Rock. And they have a handbook for land trusts. The land trusts, I sort of felt rather formal and legal, but they assured me that they also include non-profit agencies, and they are an organization that provides services and consultation for groups that are conserving land in Illinois. The combined foundations that they have listed have saved about 200,000 acres of land for conservation purposes. They advocate at the state level for conservation laws, and they do outreach to people. They have people who are specialists in GIS, the Geographic Information System, so that you can find your natural area and work with it. They do training, especially with that meeting that they have each year, and they have stewardship information. They also are involved in the background with the national level agencies that are interested in accreditation. There is always the concern that people will buy open space and then want to list it for tax purposes as a natural area, and it isn't always so. It may be a golf course which is retired, but it's not a natural area. So there's been a move afoot to accredit natural areas so that we know they are natural areas, and IRS knows what they are. IRS can do that accreditation, but they prefer to work with specialists who know what they're talking about more, and as long as the special agencies are able to do that and willing to do that, then it's better for the locals to spend perhaps a couple of $1 million having 2 or 3 foundations to be accredited. At the moment, they're working out the fine details of the procedures. What do you want to record, and what does IRS want you to record? So there's the people who are doing accreditation at the moment are looking at those principles and how they fit in. So to have a few people that are, or a few foundations that are willing to try to put this together are very helpful, because they're starting to look at the procedures for their glitches and for their advantages, and so there's a lot of getting together and doing this. The sort of people that you have as trust people include our own Grand Prairie Friends, which is has at least 400 acres of land in the Coles County area, but also Prairie at Loder and in Iroquois County and other places. There's a Land Conservation Foundation headed by Bruce Hannon, and the CEO is Deanna Glosser, and they have recently acquired bottomland behind Allerton Park near the Monticello, and they have a bottomland trail, and they maintain it. Recently there was enough floodwater that the levee was broken, and it has had to be filled. So that's another type of local foundation. At a more Chicago area, there's a foundation that is Open Lands, and it does advisory work with 7 ring county agencies and is a very responsible body. At a national level or and even international level is a Nature Conservancy. And it is more broad-based than the Prairie State Conservation Coalition, but they work with each other. And the Nature Conservancy is acquiring Kankakee River land in the Indiana area, and George Phil, who helped to put it together, has a Natural Land Institute that provides support and research and implementation. And there are other groups around, like the Illinois Environmental Council with Jennifer Walling in charge, and these people look at the legislature as well as looking at your backyard and seeing what they can do. Well, currently we have a group headed by Ben Shalovsky, who is from the Delta Institute, and his role is to bring together foundations and to see what they need for stewardship, and that involves interviewing foundations. And I said, we really aren't a foundation, but they decided that we really have information that should be gathered. So on Thursday, Ben came with a member of the Joe Davies Conservation Unit, which has been very successful. It is in the northwest corner where there's interesting unglaciated areas, but areas that have been flooded by torrents associated with glaciation. And so these were two young people who are doing work. And some of the things that they're looking for is they're trying to put a number on what we're doing, and that is a mathematical experience. It's like you have a philosophy, and then you try to put a number on the philosophy or parts of the philosophy so that you can talk to each other and understand. If, for instance, you're going to catch Lepidoptera or butterflies, you need to have a standard-sized net with standard air movement through it, and you need to make so many steps in a random manner to leave a document with the community, the research community, so that somebody else can come back in 50 years' time and do the same sort of thing. Graeber and Graeber went through the state in the 60s, but they copied a similar investigation in the early 1900s that went through the state and counted birds. And so to watch that change is rather important and helpful. So then you get into thought patterns and counting people and counting acreages. So let me look at the docket that we have here. And one of the first things that they ask for is how many acres fee simple do you own as a trust? And Then there are sometimes you don't own a fee simple because you might have a deed that is not a warranty deed, which is good ownership. You might have an easement which says, for instance, on railroad territory, that that particular piece of land may go back to the owner that gave it in the 1850s. So the non-fee simple land that you have, and then they start to look at how much forest, how much prairie, and you can look at this, and so you perhaps need to know how much land you have acquired, but you're still using it for agriculture. It's tillable land. It's and so all these savanna areas or mowen territories can have individual characteristics that you can put a label on. So first of all, you need to know what the staff is. Do you have an executive director? Do you have a stewardship that's directing programs? Do you have other program directors? Big park districts have these sorts of breakdowns. Do you have a coordinator of physical plant? Do you have fundraising directors? Do you have a specialist that works with contractors? Do you have interns? We sometimes have interns. And what is your stewardship program like? And do you have a staff that controls that? Not everyone has the luxury of all those appointments or like appointments, but in big districts like around Chicago, it is possible to make these listings. You need the number of people, and you need to know the hours they work. If it's a full-time job, then it's probably 2,000 hours a year. If it's a part-time job, they would like to know. If it's a volunteer coordinator, that's another thing you need to know, the volunteers. So some of the details that come for each of those executive directors or what have you is the time they spend for fundraising, the time they spend for management, the time for stewardship, the time for volunteers, and the time for contractors. Now, herein lies some problems in that you can probably spend 1/3 of your life recording the details. If you really get into it, you record the amount of telephone information, the time you spend on the telephone, various small costs. This can be extremely helpful if you're working with groups that really want to know what you're doing. On the other hand, it really can get to be a time-consuming event to do all these details for all those different types of jobs. So then the interviews get into more. They find out your general interests, and then they want to know what you're doing and how your particular thought processes might contribute to overall information that is bulked together and it's kept somewhat private. So what they will come up with a general detail that is bulked from a lot of interviews. And the interview we had on Thursday was their 31st interview. So you can see that they're spending time at this, and funding agencies like the Clean Air Foundation and the might not have been that, but it might have been the Victoria Foundation, which is funds these sorts of things. They want to know how you're working with integrating with other bodies like cities and counties and other agencies like Audubon or Isaac Walton League or Sierra Club. Do you have partnerships when you have a project like where you come through from Bloomington to Farmer City? Do you have not just one agency but several agencies? We were asked to do prairie preservation work or establish prairie on a drainage ditch that parallels Windsor Road. And at that point in time, there were 7 agencies combined to do this road that put a underpass under the Illinois Central Railroad at the time. And so Windsor Road would go through from Urbana through southern Champaign. When the job was finished, the road was assigned to Champaign as the designated operant. The Kickapoo Trail has had a lot of different agencies involved, and in the long run, the designated owners will be the Champaign Forest Preserve in Champaign County and the Vermilion County Conservation District in Vermilion County. So partnerships are often loose at the early stages. I would put ourselves to some extent in that category. We have spun off a number of different groups, and that's another thing that the survey is looking for is do you act as an instigator, or do you take this over permanently, and are you an in perpetuity body, or do you, like in the case of Shady Rest, the 30 acres is now in the hands of the Piatt County Forest Preserve and in perpetuity. Some of the agencies we have early on do not last forever. They're there for the convenience of getting things together, and they logically roll over to other agencies that are often established but weren't in the position to do an innovative thing in the first place. A little more on the conservative side, but a little more able to provide physical plant and connectivity in the future. So I'm looking at my notes here because we're trying to make sure that I don't leave out some things that...
It's about the halfway point, so I'll jump in here and I mention folks are listening to the Prairie Monk, WEFT's weekly look at conservation rails, trails, greenways. And Dave was talking about an interesting document that he got. Did you just get this week, you said?
Yes, we were interviewed this week.
Oh, interesting, because some of the details said they were hoping they'd actually have all the data aggregated, meaning giving out the results by this summer. I guess they've still got half the summer to go, but...
Yeah. They've been working at it, and sometimes when you do this sort of thing, it does roll over for a period so that you can discover things as you go along, and you may need to broaden your efforts.
The detail is pretty amazing. Specifically looking at the section, well, each of the sections kind of repeats the same thing. They want to know how often you update your management plan annually, every 10 years, never. You have no management plan. Do you do prescribed fires? Do you have grazing and hunt? Do you allow hunting on your land? Amazing detail across savanna and grasslands, and as you say, like tillable land. So when they're done with this thing, they're going to have a pretty extensive view of at least the bits of area that they hear back about.
Yeah, there's also looking at funding and where you get your funds, and do you have tax exemptions? If you have a overall tax exemption, or if you have local exemptions for certain things, how do you work with cities that require this sort of detail? I'm just looking a little bit here at some of the details toward the end. It was a 2-hour interview, and it goes both ways. You get to learn about what the agencies are doing and how this fits into the scope of the overall listing of all these foundations, who usually have extensive boards, and those details are presented in a handout that the Prairie State Conservation Coalition is updating. So do we belong to that handout? Probably. We go to their meetings. David has been at meeting, and you may have a comment on what you experienced at that sort of Prairie State Conservation Coalition meeting.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I actually, I have fun going to those because it is so different from what I hear about. Many of them do things having nothing to do with the prairie, and so it's interesting to find people who are concentrating on wetlands, for example. There was a great video at the last one where somebody showed this used to be wetland. Then it was turned into farmland, which means they took all of the nice meandering streams and made them straight. Well, after we got control again, we made them meander. And look what's come back. These animals, and then these animals, and then these animals. It was just really cool to see in such a short span of time how fast these things can turn back to what they were supposed to be. So when Dave talks about how he's hoping that the Pope Prairie will become a prairie again, you start thinking, but it took hundreds of years at least for that prairie to become what it was. How long is it going to take? Well, it may take a while, but it's not going to take 100 years for a noticeable change. If you can keep the off-road vehicles out of the way anyway, let things actually start to get back to where they were before.
Yeah. So, I have been also working on codes. We had a visitation from code enforcement people, and that's a real problem for us. We came here in 1980s. We had been working previously with the university and with the cities. We go back to Mayor Dexter, and it's just a long association with many different community agencies. But codes are sensible for fire, for physical plant, for all good reasons. When we came, these 4 buildings locally were empty. We could have bought 2 for something like $45,000. Now, then the community was moving north to the malls. So Penny's left and Sears left, and a lot of other more local agencies moved to the malls. And that's gone on for probably 40 years, and the downtown Champaign and Urbana have grown back it's called gentrification, and so we have lots of apartments everywhere, and the city has come back to what was a dead central business district. They tried to upgrade it there was a move afoot at the national level to put in malls. If you went to Michigan or other places, you would find main streets blocked off for malls. And some of them were rather successful, but after a while it was realized that they weren't as successful as was hoped. And the one mall that Champaign put in was on Neal Street, which is a major north-south drag, and it blocked the traffic. And the mall cost about $1 million to put in, and eventually, after several years of operation and a real genuine attempt to have markets there and to have musical events and whatnot, it was decided to take the mall out, and that cost about $1 million to take it out. Now the traffic goes through Champaign more directly on Neal Street. It's a narrow corridor. Some of that's purposeful to make sure that the traffic doesn't move too fast, and it provides parking on the sides. And there's a move to actively improve the corridor from Route 74 south through Neal Street to make it more attractive, to put in businesses. The Interstate 74 brings people to town, and often they move down Lincoln Avenue to the university, and there's a move to encourage some of that movement to come through town. Not always does moving traffic through a town increase the shopping stop-off. I've been in small towns in Iowa and Nebraska, and it has been fairly purposeful that the main drag has been run right through the middle of town. And unfortunately, the semi-trailer that's carting gravel is not going to stop for shopping. So the other alternative is to put your road, a ring road, around the town. It's like Rantoul. The road 57 goes around the town and not exactly through it. And I'm forgetting just where I was going with that. But back to gentrification. We are in a area where in the 1880s or those times, when the railroad came through, this was a place where people dropped off equipment and materials, and so Champaign, which was at that stage called West Urbana, became a more commercial town. And we have on Market Street 2 buildings that were actually put together because if you left equipment on the railroad depot area, it was subject to being stolen. So you needed warehouses where the bottom floor would be where you stored materials, and the upstairs would be a family living on that situation. That was in the era of all wood buildings was subject to fire. So you had systems at the junctions of roads, and these systems were to allow you to have water if there was a fire. The fire departments often were run by man-made equipment that you had to roll to a cistern and operate. You had horse and cart situations, and gradually that has evolved into fire departments and a very different sort of protection, and those systems have been taken out. There was public transportation in the form of interurban tramways, and the community was growing. The railroad main line, Illinois Central, was given money, given land to encourage them to put in a railroad line, and that start of that came in the 1850s, and was developed more and more in the 1860s and 70s. And it had an impact on Champaign. The railroad went through at a slight angle, so you had Illinois Central Platte that was parallel to the railroad, whereas the Jeffersonian Platte going north, south, east, and west was on a northwest, southeast basis, and you as a result have city building that is a flat iron building. It's an angle where the two plates come together. All these things are part of the history of downtown Champaign. The Market Street eventually had 8 buildings, all 100 feet long. The area had been burned, and the same had happened on Walnut Street, so a parallel 8 buildings were there. There was a alleyway behind these buildings. Weft occupies one of these buildings, and Heartland Pathways occupies another. Mark Rubel's Pogo Studio was there on the corner of Taylor Street, and there was a test and measurement unit on 4 of these buildings. One was taken out for a parking lot, but basically there were 2 rows of buildings with a 40-foot lane between, and so Weft has at the back of it an alleyway where you would you'd deliver goods and have garbage and what have you. We at the moment, one of those buildings across the road, which was not part of these twin sets of 8 buildings, was a large building that faced onto University Avenue as well as onto Market Street, and it was a Willie's Night showroom with repair activities upstairs, and that is currently being developed as a bar, as a pour your own, where you will have 15 craft beers that you can choose, and your measure will be computerized, and that's a modern way of handling a bar. Our little pocket Prairie, which is on the back side of that, will be a beer garden, so we've moved that Prairie, and it's growing successfully. But there's a question about whether other buildings that have been sold, the News Gazette buildings have been sold, as to whether that can be retained historically. If you look up on the facades, there's the element of history there. Can Market Street retain some of that character? We hope so. Well, we came here in the 1880s, very early 88, And these 4 buildings locally were vacant or very lightly used. The area had been somewhat raunchy in its day until the 50s. This had connections with the mafioso, and so this was regarded as a street of bars and starting price betting and things like that. The Grubb family came in the 1850s, middle 1850s, and they were engravers, and gradually they took over 8 of these buildings, some of them on Walnut Street and some of them on Market Street. But as the printing industry progressed, it went through from letterpress and linotypes and forming letterpress in lead and copying that with paper mache. So you sent a copy of that lead image to, say, a community like Monticello, and they would print from this by pouring their lead into the paper mache image, and then you printed from that. So then you got to the offset press, where you print it onto a sheet that then there's a miscibility of oil and water, and you would be able to print in that manner from photographic material. And then you had rotogravure and then the internet. And the Grubb family, which was providing graphic services for the paper industry, more or less closed out and left 4 buildings on Market Street somewhat empty. We were working with the university, but we were doing that with contingency money. That is money that comes to the heads of department who could employ you to do a visual display or to speak to class or be involved in planting or various things that groups like the Curriculum Lab or the Office of Instructional Resources would want done. As that sort of extension activity blossomed into the community, it was thought that as the contingency money was drying up, that it would be appropriate for us to go to the community, which we did. And we came to downtown Champaign because it was empty and the rent would be modest, and the possibility of doing things was here where the problem lies. And I don't define problem, but it certainly the city was not concentrating on the downtown Market Street area. The emphasis had gone to the malls, so providing an opportunity for the key organizations that were in town, like Sears and Penny's and others, to stay here. So the Flatiron section of Flatiron buildings that are now used for Champaign Market were taken out in order to provide parking and to try and keep agencies that eventually did go to the mall and left Champaign. We occupied one of those buildings, which we have not maintained very well. We spent a lot of time out in the field doing interesting things that we think are important to do. And we have acquired land, and we've inspired other people to do things, and we've instigated groups like the Grand Prairie Friends or the Kickapoo Trail, where we've done a lot of the initial work. One of the things that I'm doing at the moment is to list what we have done out of that building. What has that building been essential for? And it includes the like of buying a 33-mile railroad bed and working with Monticello to put in a trail to preserve the prairie on either side, to re-rail in some cases. These are not modest efforts. These are substantial, and we've needed that space. But we need to care for it. And so at the moment, we're documenting what we have done, and we need to work with the code people to make sure that we can spend $6,000 on a facade or $3,000 on windows, and a lot of internal small rules that need to be obeyed. We're sprinkled, and we've been reasonably safe, but it's time to meet the gentrification where people are coming back with big buildings and a lot of bar trade, and it's a different cat. So that's where we are at the moment, and I think we can work with the city. We've been working with the city on things like Comprehensive and Training Act, with Nixon era community for town upgrades, and we've been included in those sorts of situations. So we're hoping, and I think we're getting near the time.
1 minute to go.
And so I won't belabor the fact, but we need to upgrade our physical plant and figure out whether we can work with foundations like the Land Conservation Foundation and see if we can perhaps transfer or develop in perpetuity some of our resources that are out there, but dependent on having a key building in a downtown situation where it has been very effective and used a pocket prairie to educate, and done a lot of extension work and production of small prairies, preservation of remnant prairies, and the like. So think about that as you look on us as a community agency, perhaps in the future a foundation. So this has been Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. As always, the views and opinions expressed here are solely those of the speakers and no one else.